Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to get started shortly. We're going to let a few people join as we get going. If y'all want to type in the chat box and let us know where you are joining us from and any questions you might have for Greg as we get going. And as a reminder, if you're using the chat box feature today, don't forget to change your two settings to panelists and attendees so we can all read your messages, unless you want to send us something privately. It's the meeting of the San Angelo people today. We have a wide variety of people from all over the state and one person from Las Vegas. So.
This is awesome. I'm so glad to see such a variety from across the state. That's amazing. Thank y'all all for being here today. Including our friend from Connecticut, from Las Vegas. Wow. Somebody from Biloxi.
All right, we'll give everybody about one more minute to log on. I know I've seen this presentation, so there's lots of great content. We're excited to go ahead and get to it. While we're waiting, I'm going to go ahead and do our housekeeping and make announcements. So my name is Crystal Garcia. I am the training coordinator here at TASA. So I am happy to help you with any of your training needs, including webinars or anything your center might have coming up that you need a speaker for. Please get a hold of me. By email is the best way to contact me. So that's cgarcia@tasa.org. Just a few things coming up on our end. We are so excited to be partnering with NOVA during the month of June to offer training to any advocates, criminal justice professionals, or anyone else who is looking to partner with and create a more coordinated response for military connected survivors and their families. That training is going to be offered through NOVA. It's every Tuesday in the month of June, and it's free, and you get 14 credit hours for the National Advocate Credentialing Program. So that's a great deal, and it's free. So if you've ever done anything else with NOVA, it can be costly at times. So please feel free to register for that. We have information up about that on our website, or you can contact me directly and I can help you register. And then lastly, our conference, our state conference is going to continue to be virtual this year. We hope it's our last. As much fun as we have planning it virtually, we are excited to see you in person. But registration is open for that. There's a discount for TASA members. And if you need help with registration, that's something else I can help you do. That conference is going to be on July 25th, and it's going to actually run through July 30th. We had enough great workshop proposals that we were actually able to add a second day of conference for y'all, or a half day of conference on Friday at the same price. So please register for that. We look forward to having y'all participate in those sessions for our state conference. Our next webinar is May 25th. And before I introduce Greg, I just want to remind y'all this session is being recorded. We are going to allow people to unmute themselves and participate and interact with Greg. We know this is such an important topic, and we want y'all to be able to ask questions and really interact today. So please raise your hand. I'm more than happy to unmute you, and you can turn off your camera and speak with our presenter today. But the session is being recorded, and pending any technical difficulties, it's available on our YouTube channel about 10 days after the recording. It takes our IT people a little bit of time to process that out. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Greg. Greg and I got to work together in San Angelo back when I worked at the local level. So we also have staff from Open Arms on the call today. So it's kind of fun to all be back together working again. But this is a training that Greg has enhanced, but he did this for our victim advocates. So I got to see him do this several times, year after year after year. It's a wealth of information, such an important topic. So with that said, Greg, it's your floor.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to present on a TASA webinar, and I had the opportunity to look at the registration list coming into this, and lots of victims advocates, law enforcement, and many other community leaders on the call. So for the work that you're doing in your community, just know that it's very meaningful and impactful, and I appreciate everything you're doing. Suicide prevention is a topic that's near and dear to me. I've been involved in suicide prevention in some form for about the past 12 years. First as a crisis outreach team member here in my community, but also in formulating what we call a local outreach to suicide survivors team. So I was fortunate to be able to help develop a loss team, a local outreach team to those who have lost their loved ones to suicide. So I've had the honor and privilege to work with those who are impacted by this very important topic. And it's what's been helpful for me is framing this as another social issue, another social problem that we all need to take part in solving. So I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit here, but when we think about social problems like homelessness or veterans who are returning from war with psychological injuries, sexual assault, of course, with this group, income inequity, racial inequity. These are all problems that we individually have to take some responsibility for if we're ever going to see any change. But these are also all antecedents to suicide. All of these groups that I just mentioned are at an increased risk. And so the only way that we help solve this problem is if we start taking some personal responsibility for our neighbors, our friends, our family. And when we see that they are struggling, reach out and connect with them and have the right conversations to get them where they need for help. And so that's what the presentation is going to be about today, are things that anyone can do, regardless of your role, to reach out, ask the right questions, and get people to the help that they need so that we can overcome this stigma. We can talk openly about our mental health and get our friends and family help when they need it, and our clients as well, because I know we have a lot of advocates on the call today. I try to keep this pretty informal. If you have any questions, I know Crystal's going to monitor the chat for me in the question and answer box. If you have questions, please ask them. This is the place to ask questions, and I'm going to make sure that you have my contact information at the end of the webinar today so that you can reach out to me anytime you need to, and I am happy to help where I can. So I've already given you a little bit of information about who I am. Primarily, I am a psychotherapist by training. I am licensed as a professional counselor here in the state of Texas. And, after getting my feet wet on the crisis team and doing some local nonprofit management here in mental health, I have since moved on to our Region 15 Education Service Center that's out of San Angelo, Texas. And I'm honored to be one of their mental health specialists. So essentially, what I do is help support 43 school districts and the mental health initiatives that they implement in their schools with their students. And so I get to do a lot of consulting there. That picture there is our little footprint here in West Central Texas. But what's really important for you to know, if you are one of our Texas folks on the line today, is what these regional education service centers do. So I started at ours about a year ago. And prior to that, I had no idea the work that these talented people that work at these service centers do around the state. So every school, every district in Texas is covered by what we call an ESC, an Education Service Center. And those service centers are packed full of staff who help everybody from superintendents to principals and school boards do their job, to teachers. So we have very talented curriculum and instruction staff who teach teachers how to instruct math, technology, engineering, social sciences, history. We have nutrition experts, data services experts. Really, we are a group of behind the scenes people who support the work that your educators do in schools. Now, I'm part of the mental health piece of that for our Education Service Center. But what's really important for everybody to know is that if you are interested in learning more about what schools can do to help with mental health in schools, or what these ESEs can do. According to House Bill 19, which came out in the 86th legislature, every one of these education service centers has to have a mental health education liaison on site. These are individuals who are licensed professionals who help schools figure out how to handle many of those mental health problems that we see: trauma, grief and loss, and suicide. Many region centers, including ours, have additional mental health specialists available. So I actually operate under a Department of Education grant to support our school counselors and the work that they do. But we also have a need for increased training for educators. And so hopefully this brings some hope to all of you for our youth, because we have had some excellent pushes coming out of the Texas legislature to increase training on trauma and suicide prevention in schools, grief and loss for educators, and especially with Senate Bill 11, and don't worry, you're not going to get quizzed on any of this. Schools now must have safe and supportive schools teams and behavioral threat assessment teams, so that if students are struggling, if there's been a threat against the school, or if students are talking about suicide or cutting or all of those things that are just really hard to think about students struggling with, we have a team of people at each school who can come together and resource those students who are impacted by that. So just some interesting legislation that's come out recently that I think is going to be greatly impactful in our schools, and certainly something that I'm passionate about. So connect with those mental health professionals at your ESCs to learn more. But that's a little bit about what I do, a little bit about my background. So now we'll just go ahead and dive right in. But before we dive in, please know that we are going to be talking about some sensitive subject matter today. And of course, you all probably knew that when you signed up for it. We have suicide in the title, but wrapped up in suicide is also trauma and general mental health. And just statistically speaking, the mass majority of people on this call have been impacted by those things in some way. So if you need to step away for a moment and take a break, please do. You can always come back and watch what you missed via the YouTube. If you need linkage to support, or if you want to otherwise talk about this presentation in greater detail, please get a hold of me. That's my email. That's my phone number. We'll repeat that again at the end so that you have it. Please connect with us and let us know how we can improve and how we can help. The other disclaimer I like to make, what I am doing today is hopefully giving you some tools that you can take with you to help those who might be struggling. We are not teaching anybody to be a therapist or diagnose mental illness or provide any kind of treatment. This is merely just to help you become a better gatekeeper. And we use gatekeeper to describe somebody who can watch out for the warning signs when somebody is struggling and get those people to help. So what we're going to talk about today, just so you know what's coming your way, we are going to, of course, talk about some suicide facts. We have to talk about some statistics, what the prevalence looks like, kind of put this problem into scope for us. We're going to talk about myth versus reality, because we know that with suicide, there are a lot of things that we probably grew up believing about it that just may not necessarily be true. So we're going to make some corrections to our understanding there. But of course, we're going to talk about risk factors. So what predisposes somebody who might struggle with thoughts of suicide? But most importantly, what can we observe? What can we look out for so that we can take care of our fellow community members? But the meat and potatoes, the most important thing is how you can help those who are struggling, because a lot of folks have no earthly clue what they would do if somebody came to them and said, I'm having thoughts of suicide. And there are a lot of things that get in the way of that. What happens if they say yes? Am I going to say something that makes this worse? These are all common anxieties people have. So hopefully we can talk about that in a little more detail. We're going to talk about what to do, what not to do, how to know somebody is struggling, but most importantly, what questions do we ask and how do we ask them? And what can we do to take action to keep this person safe? So that's the agenda for today. One thing that I do want to point out is the fact that our language surrounding suicide matters, and it matters a great deal, especially to those who have been impacted by a suicide loss. So you will hear me today, unless I slip up, because we all do, use the phrase died by suicide instead of committed suicide. And the reason that I do that is because, generally speaking, the word committed is not associated with very positive things. We talk about folks who commit crimes. We talk about folks who commit adultery or commit sin if you're religiously inclined. We talk about folks who are committed to a hospital, but rarely do we associate that with something positive. And what we don't want to do is associate a suicide loss with some kind of a criminal activity. And this comes directly from working with those who have survived a suicide loss. Using died by suicide instead is much more humane for them, especially as those who are grieving. Also acceptable, you can say took their own life, or you can speak to the method that was used. So Bill shot or hanged himself, whatever the case may be. But we do want to steer clear of committed. And for me, it was really kind of eye-opening how deeply ingrained that language was, because it's really hard to overcome. But with practice, I think that we can all make that shift. I also tend to refer to a completed suicide or just simply a suicide attempt instead of talking about a successful or a failed suicide attempt. This is something else we don't want to do, is start to associate, even at the language level, suicide with success or failure. So completed suicide, suicide attempt are the preferred vernacular for that. And in all things, whether we're talking about suicide or not, when it comes to mental health issues, I recommend just using that person first language. And so instead of saying that schizophrenic guy, Brad, you just simply say, Brad, who is diagnosed with schizophrenia. What we want to do with this is put some distance between the person and their mental illness, because mental illness is just one part of our experience as human beings. And in fact, most of us, over 3/4 of us, will experience some kind of a significant, impactful mental health challenge at some point in our life. And I don't think anybody wants to be defined by that. So when we use that person first language, yes, it may sound on the surface like we're just being politically correct. I think it's just the more humane thing to do. We are highlighting the fact that people are more than their struggles with thoughts of suicide. They are more than their mental illness. And so I highly recommend trying to make some of these language shifts if you haven't already, because it can mean the world to somebody who is struggling, and it can mean a lot to those who have been left behind after a suicide death. So any questions that come along as we talk about these things, please, again, feel free to put them in the Q&A. Please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll try to monitor that and answer as we go along. But the first thing that we need to ask ourselves is, why suicide? And we kind of have to put suicide in some kind of perspective. So I'm going to try not to bore everybody with just a bunch of statistics, but I think that it's important to talk about. I think it kind of puts this in scope for us. So there's always a little bit of a lag in the data. And so this is kind of a mixture of data that I have found between 2018 and 2020. It'll probably be well into 2022 before we even start to get data on 2021. But what we know, looking at the most recent data, is that about 132 Americans die by suicide every day. And we know that when we break that down to more of a community level, when we look at, say, a community the size of mine. So I live in San Angelo, Texas. We have just over 100,000 folks living here. Per 100,000 people, the national average has actually risen, and it continues to rise from about 10.4 folks in 2000 to about 13.93 in those communities. So we do see the suicide rate creeping upward, especially in some of our rural communities. And if I had more time today, we could get into, a lot of the reasons as to why that is. But it's just simple to kind of remember that those rural communities who tend to be a little more isolated tend to have a greater access to firearms, engage in work that's a little more isolated, like agriculture and oil field work. They tend to have less access to mental health services. You tend to see higher rates of suicide in those smaller communities. We also know that suicide is the second leading cause of death for college kids, as well as people aged 10 to 34 in general. We know that about 10.3% of Americans have considered suicide at some point. And something else that really kind of hit me right in the heart, when we look at our youth, our kids in school aged 13 to 18 years old, about 17% of them have seriously considered suicide at some point. About 15% of them have actually planned out the details as to how they would take their own life. And about 10% of them have actually done something to attempt to end their own life. And so certainly something that we are paying very close attention to with our youth, and something to be mindful of. But one of the more important statistics is this one. more than just impacting those who struggle with thoughts of suicide or depression, about 54% of Americans have been deeply affected by suicide in some way. So either they have lost somebody that they care about, or they themselves have struggled with thoughts of suicide. But what a large number of people. And for that many people to be struggling, we have a big problem talking about suicide. We have a very severe issue with talking about mental health openly, asking the right questions of those who are struggling. And there are a number of reasons for that that we'll talk about. But in 2018, about 48,000 people died by suicide in the United States. And to put that into some perspective, that is enough people to fill about 12 high school football stadiums. And so I didn't just pick this picture at random here. I tried to find a football stadium that held about 4,000 people. And this is about the size that we're looking at. So if you can imagine 12 stadiums of this size filled to the brim, full house with people, that's about the number of people that we lose in the United States per year. And they use a number of methods. The most common are firearms. So about 51% of suicide deaths result from firearm use. It is one of the more popular in our part of the world, in rural West Texas here where I live, simply because you have ease of access there. Firearm use is also about 95% effective, somewhere between 90 and 95%. And those who do survive those suicide attempts have a greatly diminished quality of life. So as we go on today, we're going to talk about the importance of means restriction when somebody is struggling, making sure that we get those firearms out of the house while they work through their difficulties. Following firearms, we see suffocation or hanging at about 26%, poisoning or overdose at about 14.9%, and 8.2% of folks use some other kind of method. But by a long shot, firearms are the leading cause, which I think has some implications for working on means restriction, which we'll get into later. Here at home in Texas, in 2020, we lost 3,930 individuals to suicide, with an average of 13.66 losses per 100,000 residents. So we are pretty well keeping pace with the national average, though slightly below. That is, to put that into some perspective, about 3 times the number of people that we lost to alcohol-related vehicle accidents. And probably one of the more tragic ways I have seen this put, that's 87,000 years of potential life lost prior to the age of 65. So when we take a person who has died by suicide's life and we just assume, a death at the age of 65, even when that 65 figure is set really low and well below the average lifespan, we have lost almost 90,000 years of human life. We have lost all of the roles that go along with that: fathers, mothers, brothers and sisters, grandparents, nieces, nephews, friends, coworkers. 87,000 years. And to me, that's heartbreaking. And that shows us that we have a lot of work to do. And it starts with this. And this is why I titled this presentation the way I did. We have to undo this issue with stigma that we have. Suicide routinely appears in the top 10 causes of death across all of our age ranges, but it is the most stigmatized cause of death. It is the most joked about. It is the most trivialized. It is the least understood, because those who have struggled with thoughts of suicide prior to their death did not want to open up and talk about it. And those who have died by suicide are no longer with us to provide us with answers. And so with heart disease, with cancer, with all of these physical ailments, we have some kind of an answer as to why a person passes away. With suicide, we just don't have the whole picture, and that's hard to work with. And so we don't talk about it enough. And in a lot of cases, we have folks walking around in day-to-day life who insist that they're fine, that they are okay, and their suicidal thoughts often go unaddressed and untreated. And so the problem with suicide is it blends very, very well into everyday life. And unless we start paying very close attention to very subtle warning signs and asking the right questions, we are not going to be able to solve this problem as a group. And we are going to continue seeing that upward trend that we're seeing nationally. And that's what I hope to help everybody with today, is arm you with the warning signs to look out for and the questions that you need to ask when you see somebody struggling. And we do have a very, very long way to go. And I've included a picture here of the Golden Gate Bridge for a couple of reasons. Typically, when we think about bridges, they serve as a beautiful metaphor for things. So we can form a bridge to recovery, perhaps, working with a local organization who helps us with our mental health difficulties, our substance use difficulties. When we connect with somebody, we build a bridge with them, we build a relationship with them. When we have relationships that aren't healthy for us, perhaps we burn that bridge and we move forward with our life. Whenever our pets pass away, we say that they cross over the rainbow bridge. In this instance, this bridge in particular, the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, California, is a different kind of metaphor. And it's a different kind of metaphor for two reasons. The first is this: it is the #2 suicide destination in the world. And this gets a little graphic, and I apologize, but the deck of that bridge sits about 250 feet above the water. And when somebody, makes a suicide attempt off of that bridge and completes that suicide, it is because they fall at about a speed of 75 miles per hour and they hit the water. And it is though you have essentially hit concrete. And when somebody dies by suicide on this bridge, it is about 95 to 99% effective. And over about the past 40 years, there have been 1,500 deaths resulting from jumping off of this bridge. And about a handful of people, about 40 to 50, have lived to tell the tale. And I bring this up for two reasons. And the first reason is this. When you talk to those folks who have dove off of this bridge and have lived, almost all of them say the same thing. The instant that they jumped off the railing, they regretted that decision. And in one hand, it's heartbreaking. In the other, it offers me a lot of hope for those who struggle with thoughts of suicide, because what that means to me is that although they are struggling with a very deep pain and they view suicide as the only solution, there is a very large, loud part of them that wants to live. And that's what we need to tap into with those who are struggling. That's why we have to take some responsibility to ask the right questions when we see somebody struggling, because it may not take as much as you think to turn that person's thinking around and get them problem solving a little better than they currently are and save their life. The other reason I bring the Golden Gate Bridge into this is because I think that it points to not just an individual stigma that we have around help seeking, but it points to a societal problem. And here's why. So because over 1,500 people have lost their lives, the citizens of San Francisco and citizens abroad have all begged for years and years the city of San Francisco to put a netting system underneath this bridge to save people's lives. And for the longest time, they said no, over and over and over again. And their reasonings were this. Number one, it's going to cost about $200 million. And that's really, really expensive to put that netting underneath that bridge. The second thing they said is, if we're going to spend that kind of money, that method of suicide prevention has to be at least 100% effective. And we just don't think it's going to be. The third reason, and this is probably the most upsetting for me personally, is that it would ruin the aesthetic or the beauty of a major tourist attraction. And that directly translates into funding lost and money lost. And so here at the societal level, we see stigma differently. We see putting money ahead of human life. We see putting aesthetic and beauty over human life. And we have this irrational expectation that any single method of suicide prevention must be 100% effective. And so I think that really points to the issue of stigma, not just at the individual level, but at the societal level that we have to overcome. But I'm always going to bring it back to hope, because here in this next image, we can see that we are getting there. So after years and years of hearing from the citizens, after hearing from very loud, vocal, passionate advocates, the city of San Francisco decided it was time to do something about this problem. And they are currently in the process of installing a netting system, all 200 million worth of it, underneath the bridge. They started in 2017 and are expected to complete that project by 2023. And so to me, the Golden Gate Bridge represents a lot of things as a metaphor. It represents not only the stigma that we've had to combat, but this idea that we can get where we need to be as long as we take that responsibility. And we are loud, vocal advocates for those who struggle with mental illness, thoughts of suicide. And we work at the individual and societal level to make good change. And so that's been an interesting story to follow. Now, we get into the presentation here, we have to talk about myths versus reality. And so these are certain myths that we want to combat. The first is this: if someone talks about the possibility of dying by suicide, they are not likely to follow through with it. That's a huge myth. What we actually know is that, of course, we have to take any threat or sign of suicide very seriously. And we know that the mass majority of people who have died by suicide have actually verbalized those thoughts beforehand. So in fact, about 90% of people who have died by suicide at some point in their life have said something or communicated something to somebody about their thoughts before taking their own life. We know that this myth, suicide happening with little to no warning, is absolutely false. The problem is some of these warning signs can be very, very subtle that we are going to talk about today. And most people actually exhibit one or more of those risk factors before taking their own life. And so we'll go well into some protective factors, some risk factors, and some warning signs today as we go along. But it really takes being very attentive to the people that you work with, to the people that you care about in your personal life, to what you're seeing, what you're hearing from them, and really trying to get to know them and what some of their risk and protective factors are. So it can take a lot of detail orientation from you, but the idea is that we can spot somebody who's on this pathway to suicide and intervene to get them help if we are willing to pay that kind of attention. We also know that it is a myth that suicidal individuals are fully committed to dying. A lot of people believe that once they've made this decision, there's no turning back. They're just not going to tell anybody. I would not do what I do as a therapist and as an educator if I for 1 minute believed that to be true. What we know about suicide is it's not about commitment. It's about problem solving. These are people who struggle with intense emotional pain, and who among us hasn't dealt or had to handle emotional pain before. And sometimes our problem solving gets skewed and we start to view our problems as unsolvable and permanent. And we begin to view help as something that isn't likely to help us. And what we need to do is intervene in such a way that we offer hope, that we offer help and guidance and get folks where they need to be. In fact, we know that most people are what we call suicide ambivalent. So if you'll remember, when talking about the Golden Gate Bridge, we talked about those folks who jumped from the railing and instantly regretted that decision. And that is a key result of that suicide ambivalence. These individuals would choose to live if they only had the right help to overcome that overwhelming emotional pain. There is a myth that men are far more likely to have suicidal thoughts, and that's actually not true. Excuse me. Men are actually 4 times more likely to complete suicide than women. However, women attempt suicide 3 times more often than men. And the reason why we see this disparity in suicide deaths with men versus women is men tend to choose far more lethal means. Women tend to choose, for the most part, overdoses, whereas men tend to be more likely to choose firearms. So just kind of checking in on the chat here, as I like to do. Somebody has posted Kevin Hines' story in the chat box. Kevin Hines, for those who don't know, is actually a survivor of a suicide attempt from the Golden Gate Bridge. He is one of those people who has been extensively interviewed, and he does a lot of motivational speaking, and his story is very much heart-wrenching. And so you can absolutely check in on Kevin Hines and his story. And to this day, he's very honest that he still struggles with mental illness and depression. And I do highly recommend his story. Another common myth, suicides occur more frequently in the winter months or over the holidays. This was actually surprising to me when I first read it. The reality is suicides actually occur more frequently in the spring and summer. And the jury is still out as to why exactly that is, but there have been some interesting theories posited out there. So this idea that in the winter, where it's cold outside, the weather outside is frightful, so to speak, we tend to go into this emotional and connective like hibernation where it's almost expected that we're not going to be as connected with people. But then summer and spring come along where the expectation for us is that we are going to connect. We're going to go to barbecues, we're going to go to pool parties, and all of that. And those who struggle with connections, those who have strained relationships or a difficult time forming relationships have this expectation placed upon them. And you're more likely to struggle with depression in the face of that expectation for connection. There's also the idea that maybe during the holidays, like Christmas and Thanksgiving, or whatever you culturally celebrate yourself, families are more protective than they are harmful. And there's also this idea that you actually see an uptick in the summer in agitation, anger, because it's hot outside. And we actually see, when you look at the data, an uptick in manic symptoms for individuals who struggle with bipolar disorder in the hotter months too. And your risk for suicide, of course, goes up with an increase in some of those symptoms. And so there are some theories about why that is, but intuitively we would think the holidays would be stressful, or you're dealing with strained relationships and you'd see more suicides, but that's just not the case. But the biggest myth of all, and the one that we have to combat today, and I'm just going to keep coming back to this, is that asking a depressed individual about suicide and suicidal thoughts may push them to attempt. And we know that this absolutely, unequivocally is not true when you look at the research. In fact, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, the American Association of Suicidology, all of these leading research groups and think tanks and resource centers in the field of suicide have all agreed this is absolutely not true. And when you look at the peer-reviewed research, it's definitive. You aren't going to give somebody the thought of taking their own life simply by talking about it. And so you are free to discuss this with people as you wish. In fact, talking about suicide appears to be one of the first steps to overcoming, because here we have somebody who has likely been fighting against stigma for a very long time and feeling as though they can't open up to somebody about this difficulty. And now they have somebody who has noticed that they are struggling. They're asking about thoughts of suicide, and it opens the door to some communication that they may have never been able to have with somebody before. And so certainly something that we want to do is talk about it when we see the signs. So some risk factors, and this is probably a good time to point out that risk factors are a lot different than warning signs. Risk factors are those things that predispose us to a certain action or a certain ailment of some kind. They are things that we may not immediately know about somebody, but it's good to know people. It's good to kind of reach deep and have these deep, meaningful conversations with folks, especially when you start to spot the signs, start asking about some of these things, because risk goes up exponentially with some of these things. So if they have some kind of a psychiatric history, in fact, we know that 70% of those who have died by suicide have struggled with some kind of diagnosable mental health problem. If they have a history of suicide attempts, that significantly increases the risk as well. But most important for what we're talking about today is if they have a plan for suicide. So beyond just having these fleeting thoughts of taking their own life, if they have actually started to work through the details of figuring out how they're going to take their own life, certainly if they have access to a lethal means for suicide, risk goes through the roof on that. And it is time to take emergency action to help. But more on that in just a little while. We know that depression symptoms significantly increase the risk of suicide, but not everybody who struggles with severe depression actually has thoughts of suicide. In fact, the mass majority of folks who struggle with depression as a diagnosis don't experience thoughts of suicide, but the risk does go up. We know that poverty and socioeconomic stress is very much a risk factor, and certainly something that we want to pay more attention to given what we're going through with the COVID crisis. And in fact, at least in our youth, we have seen about a 30% increase in visits to the emergency room for suicide attempts. And so something to be aware of, that this COVID crisis and the economic impact, which is something that we are probably going to be dealing with for quite a while, has significantly predisposed folks to suicide risk. We know that if they have multiple environmental stressors going on at one time, and they are just cognitively overloaded with, having to deal with the COVID crisis and the financial fallout, if they are a parent now having to fulfill multiple roles at home, as caregiver, as teacher, whatever the case may be, we know that as those multiple environmental stressors pile up on somebody, they feel less equipped to cope with that. And that can also be a major risk factor. If they lack family and social support, and this is huge. And this is why I think we all need to start being very attentive to what we see in our coworkers and our family and friends. I think that it is good to assume that you are going to be the only person who has noticed that they are struggling and the only person who is willing to reach out. And this is an age-old social psychology issue that we call diffusion of responsibility, where we see somebody struggling with something and we just assume somebody else is going to take care of it, and we go on about our day because we think, you know what, that is such an obvious problem they're struggling with. Surely somebody else, like their mom or their dad or their sister or their brother, is going to find this and figure something out for them. Let's not assume that. Let's assume we are going to be the only person who cares and reaches out. And one of my favorite truisms, and I try to avoid cliche stuff as much as possible, but this one really struck me. The opposite of depression is not happiness. The opposite of depression is connection. And to me, that's just really powerful. If we can connect with people who struggle with these things, imagine the good that we can do. It seems counterintuitive, but recent psychiatric hospitalization actually increases your risk. We think that, okay, so we've sent somebody to a psychiatric hospital, they've received some kind of medication, and now they're good to go. For about 72 hours after that hospitalization, risk goes through the roof. The reason being, psychiatric hospitals are really good at keeping people safe in the short term, but they don't necessarily have a lot of time while they're there. They're there for about 3 to 5 days for the most part, which is not enough time if they're starting an antidepressant for that antidepressant to kick in and build up to a therapeutic level in their bloodstream. They don't have a lot of time to establish a genuine therapeutic counseling relationship with a mental health professional. And so it is very key if somebody is coming out of a psychiatric hospital, whether that is a client that you're working with, or a student in a school, or another adult or a friend or family member, that they are linked to ongoing mental health care, that they have somebody who is connected to them, who is checking in with them on how they're doing and keeping that conversation going, because we know that that risk is going to go up, and that follow-up rates after you get out of a psychiatric hospital it's not a great statistic. And so we want to make sure that we're connecting people to ongoing help. If there is a family history of suicide or a family history of depression, your risk does go up. If you are a suicide loss survivor, so somebody has died by suicide, your risk goes up by about 60%. And the way that I kind of think about that is kind of like a window. You know, if you haven't lost somebody to suicide, that's a window that we don't often think about. It's closed off to us. But when somebody dies by suicide who is close to us, that window opens a little bit. And it doesn't have to be a family member either. After Robin Williams passed away, that was kind of at the height of my crisis intervention. And in about the 2 months that followed Robin Williams' passing of suicide, I spoke to several clients who actually cited his death as something that kind of opened that window for them. And the idea was essentially somebody who appeared that joyful, if they can end their life, you know, what does that say about my prospects? And so it can just be somebody important to us that isn't necessarily connected. So that suicide contagion is something we have to be aware of. We know that chronic and physical illness and pain may also be a risk factor. So just being in unbearable physical pain every day increases that risk. Having a history of childhood trauma, and to that I will speak to, and if you've got time, you can look into this, adverse childhood experiences. So there has been a lot of research over the past 20 to 25 years into not just, you know, severe traumas, but just those things that are adverse as we're growing up. Being a child of divorce, being neglected in some way or abused in some way. And they have found that the more of these adverse childhood experiences that you have had, greatly increases your risk of suicide. It increases your risk of substance use. It increases your risk of incarceration, heart disease, and early death, and many other things. And so suicide is certainly wrapped up in that. So if you are interested in learning more about ACEs, if you just did a Google search on adverse childhood experiences, you will find some of the top websites on that phenomenon. So along with that, we do know that a history of physical and sexual abuse contributes, but also alcohol and substance use. And so when you look at the data, about 1/3 of suicide deaths actually involved severe intoxication of some kind of substance at the time of death. And so your risk factor goes up quite a bit if you are abusing alcohol or substances. What we also know about alcohol and substance use, when you talk to those who struggle with comorbid depression and substance use, is that the primary reason those substances are used is to numb emotional pain and numb, some of those problems. And so it becomes a form of psychological avoidance using this substance. So it's not necessarily the substance itself that contributes, although it does disinhibit you and can lead to a suicide in the moment, but it's what's going on underneath that substance use. So my urging to everybody regarding alcohol and substance use is, if you see somebody struggling with that, don't be afraid to ask what it is that that person likes about using those substances. Instead of approaching these issues with shame and guilt, try to help them get to the bottom of what's going on, not necessarily to be their therapist, but just to show that you care, and then link those individuals as well to the kinds of help that we're talking about today. So diving into a few of these risk factors, psychiatric history, these are just some common diagnoses that we see prevalent in cases of suicide. We won't go into too much detail on this, but depression, bipolar disorder, especially those who are in a manic state with that bipolar disorder, where their mood is really elevated and they're very seemingly agitated and internally and externally agitated. Those who struggle with schizophrenia and other thought disorders, alcohol dependency, polysubstance dependency, PTSD, eating disorders, and personality disorders. We do see those multiply the risk. And of course, the risk multiplies with that comorbid substance use. Previous suicide attempts. So there's been some studies done on individuals who have gone to the emergency room for suicide attempts. And we know that about 10% of them will die by suicide within 10 years. And that's a very harrowing statistic. And I think that points to our need, with that first suicide attempt, to make sure that that individual gets ongoing mental health care and routine check-ins. Other research has followed attempters kind of in a longitudinal way, and they found that over a period of 22 years, about 7% of those who had attempted suicide in that time frame wound up dying by suicide. And we know that about 80% of individuals who die by suicide have made at least one attempt in the past. And so we know, looking at the research, that this greatly increases the risk. So that's some of the risk factors. We also should talk about those things that are protective. What's the positive flip side of this? So again, the opposite of depression is not happiness. The opposite of substance use is not sobriety. It is connection on both counts. And so making sure that individuals have positive connections to family and friends and community, and also that those connections encourage help seeking. And that is something huge that you can do, is when you ask the questions after spotting the warning signs we're talking about today, that you encourage them to seek help and you keep coming back to that. And sometimes you have to be really, really persistent. You have to show this persistence in your empathy and your caring. And you may not crack that egg right there at the beginning. It may take a while to build some trust with this person because maybe they've never spoken about this before. But if you can crack that egg just a little bit and start kind of feeding into this idea that there's help and there's hope out there, you are more likely to get them where they need to be. Make sure that the help that we're connecting people to is evidence-based, and making sure that they are getting treatment from licensed providers who know how to treat what's going on, from depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety, to suicidal thoughts. There are many, many mental health providers out there with excellent training in some of these EBPs. Making sure they have strong problem-solving skills. So again, suicide primarily, when we conceptualize it, is an issue of problem solving. we are starting to view problems as unsolvable and permanent. And so there's great evidence behind treatment programs like cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention, where the goal is to help kickstart some of that problem solving very early on in therapy to get people over that emotional hump. And so those who have stronger problem solving skills tend to be much more protected. Affirming cultural and faith institutions. And so I cannot stress that word affirming near enough, because there are some cultural and faith institutions out there that are not very affirming of who individuals are. There are faith and cultural traditions that shun suicide as a moral issue, and also protected groups like the LGBT group. And so make sure that those cultural and faith institutions that we're involved in are affirming of who we are as people. So affirming is the key word there. Making sure they have caring contacts from caregivers and loved ones who care about them. And so we have found that, at least in the therapy world, when we are engaged in some kind of a relationship with a client, a working relationship, it helps for them to get an email from us or a phone call, or within your boundaries, as long as you're using a work phone, a text message or something to that effect that just said, hey, I'm thinking about you and just want to make sure that you're doing okay today. How have you been? Is there anything that I can help with? And so having those routine caring contacts from people can be really, really protective. And something we're going to talk a little more in detail about: reducing access to lethal means. The single most effective thing that you can do to save somebody is actually taking away that thing that they were planning on using to take their own life. Most of the times that involves locking away firearms, locking away medications, and we'll talk about some specifics there in here just a little bit. So those were risk factors and protective factors. Those are things that may not be readily obvious to you about that person and their experience and what they're going through. These are things that you can maybe start to look for. Some of them you may see that are observable, some you may not, but these are some common symptoms in those who struggle with thoughts of suicide. So just a general feeling of helplessness or hopelessness. And so one of the questions that we're going to talk about asking is, have you ever had a thought that you would rather, wake up dead, or would you rather go to sleep and not wake up? And the answer to that question generally points us towards, how helpless and hopeless they are feeling. We also know that many of those who struggle with anxiety and panic attacks may be at an increased risk. We may notice that they are aggressive, lashing out, because anger tends to cover up other emotions like sadness, depression, shame, and embarrassment. And so rather than address that feeling, a lot of us have learned through social learning that, it seems more productive, at least on the surface, for us to get angry and bow up and make ourselves big and appear stronger than we are in the moment. And so we do see some aggression and some irritability in depression, and not just anger for anger's sake. Those who struggle with thought disorders and may struggle with what we call psychotic symptoms like hallucinations, just a disorganized thought process or disorganized kind of seemingly bizarre behaviors, may be at an increased risk as well. Those who choose not to take prescribed medications, especially if that medication has been shown to be effective for them. Sometimes those medications come with some really intense side effects, and to them in the moment, those side effects kind of outweigh the positive benefit. Or if you're like me, I have a hard time just remembering to take my daily vitamins every day. So sometimes it's just hard to remember to take those medications, and that may lead to a difficulty. Lack of energy and motivation, lack of sleep, anhedonia, all of these being symptoms of depression, that anhedonia being kind of the key feature in depression, just this losing of interest and motivation in things that we used to find pleasurable, like our hobbies and our daily activities. Of course, change in appetite. So we may have an appetite change up or down, eating too much, eating too little. So things that you can start to pay attention to. These are more so behavioral warning signs. So these are things that you can start to pay very, very close attention to. And again, it can be very, very subtle. So talking about suicide, and not just talking about suicide, but I talk to teachers about this a lot. A lot of times people will take their suicidal thoughts and turn that into some kind of an art form. So if they are creating paintings that are of a very dark nature, if you find that they are listening to darker music than they usually do, or if they seem kind of preoccupied with death as just a subject in general, that can be a sign that they are considering suicide as an option. If they are seeking access to means, and so I talk to teachers and parents about this a lot, monitor what our youth are looking up on the internet. Make sure that our data services in schools are engaged in kind of looking at what students are searching for. Because if we notice that they are seeking that access to means, we know that their risk is going to go up immediately. So if they are looking at purchasing firearms, if they are looking at obtaining medications that can be lethal in large doses, that can be a sign that they are really struggling. Again, talking about death to the point of preoccupation, especially if this is new for them and it is seemingly coming out of nowhere. If they are withdrawing socially and emotionally from those that care about them, if they are starting to give away prized possessions, this can be kind of an end sign that they have reached this decision for themselves and we need to intervene because they are toward the very end of that pathway. And so, and this is probably one of the more subtle things we have to pick up on. And so along with that giving away of prized possessions, we may see kind of a sudden sense of calm, especially when they have been through a period of emotional turmoil. And so if they have seemingly reached a place of peace and they start giving away these prized possessions, that's a sign that we definitely need to start asking some questions. If they're engaging in self-destructive behaviors and self-harming behaviors, self-harm like cutting or burning or excoriating the skin may not necessarily mean that somebody is having thoughts of suicide, because those are two completely different phenomena. But if they do engage in those self-harming behaviors, we know that their risk level does go up quite a bit. And so we still need to address that issue. If they are just seemingly getting their affairs in order, again, if you have that sudden sense of calm, certainly something that we need to be very, very attentive to. So when we talk about verbalizing thoughts of suicide, it's not always going to come out as I'm having thoughts of suicide. Some suicidal thoughts may sound like I'd be better off dead, or everyone would just be better off if I weren't here. And to me, that kind of phrasing really kind of points to this idea that they just as strongly believe that they are a burden to others as you believe that they are not. And so here we start to see some of that underlying problem-solving issue and just perception issues in general. But these are very strong thoughts for them. And so when we look at the research, especially by Joyner and his colleagues back in the mid 2010s, they've really kind of took a look at what kind of characteristics suicidal individuals share in common. And one of those was just a sense of burdensomeness, this idea that they're a burden to others, that they would be better off. And so this is kind of a key indicator that somebody is struggling with those thoughts of suicide. Or they may just be blunt and say, I'm going to kill myself. They can also say, I just can't live this way anymore. I just want to go to sleep and not wake up. Or I hate that I woke up today or woke up this morning. Sometimes I just want to end it all, or I hate my life. I just want it to be over. And so a variety of different ways, and there are many that I have left off here just for the sake of time, that may indicate that somebody is struggling. So it doesn't always sound like what you would expect it to sound like, but all of these kind of share that sense of hopelessness and helplessness and burdensomeness in common. Now, what I don't want to do is try to get it in folks' head that there is some kind of a profile for who is at risk, because we have risk across age groups and across ethnicities, but we do see some trends in certain areas. So the largest growing, and it has remained the largest group of those at risk, are middle-aged white males. So they actually make up about 70% of nationwide suicides, our white males do. 45 to 64 years. So middle age makes up about 38% of nationwide suicides. And so by and large, it is the largest group, or middle-aged white males who are most affected. Age 65 and older actually comprise one of the next largest groups, which was 18% of nationwide suicides. And so remember, one of those risk factors involves chronic medical conditions or pain. And that is certainly something that we see to a greater degree in our elder Americans here at home. And so something to be attentive to there. Those who are separated, divorced, or widowed, or living alone may struggle with limited social supports. Those who are unemployed, retired, or otherwise out of the labor force. So, of course, here in American culture, we are very work-centric, and we assign a lot of our own personal value according to what we do for a living. And so if somebody has lost an important job, or if they have just kind of naturally reached retirement age, and they've generally lost that sense of purpose or dedication to a cause or some kind of organization, they may feel that despair. And also
Right, we have a comment that you might be able to speak on just a little bit more. Lisa says it's helpful to know that medications can be lethal themselves as well as increase suicidality. Believe people when they say they don't like the meds. People have the right to informed choice.
Absolutely. And so, Lisa, thank you for pointing that out. A lot of people, just tend to think that we'll just give people a medication and they'll be fine. But a lot of those medications do come with some psychiatric side effects as well. So I'm glad you pointed that out because we can speak on that a little bit. On a personal note, I actually had a very, very bad reaction to a medication for anxiety once. I was in college. I won't name the medication. And fortunately, I did have a doctor who listened to me, and we figured out something to work around that. But one of the most common complaints that we hear about psychiatric medication providers is they don't listen to me when I say that the medication is not working. And so if you are somebody who works with, patients, and you are in a place where you can prescribe medications, or you're just a family member and you need to advocate for them, Lisa, I agree. You have to listen to them and trust them when they say that medication is not working for them. And absolutely, they have a right to patient-informed care and patient choice. And so, and sometimes that takes being a very persistent, advocate. But thank you, Lisa, for bringing that up. I very much agree. Good point. So some other vulnerable populations that we need to be aware of. So we know that members of the LGBTQIA plus community are at a 3 to 4 times risk of suicide. They face perhaps, I don't want to say more than any other group, but they face a very kind of targeted almost rejection sometimes from those supports that are supposed to be supportive for them. In our schools, I remember reading a very harrowing statistic that 60% of LGBT plus students report some kind of harassment or bullying, not from their peers, but from school staff. And to me, this is one of those situations where connecting with these individuals and avoiding shame and embarrassment because of who they are as people becomes crucial in saving their life. And so, when I talk to educators about this group, regardless of their beliefs, regardless of how they feel about these individuals, we have to explore whether or not for them, is it worth accepting them in the moment to save their life? Because we know that they are at an increased risk. And so it's very key that we tune into that and be attentive to it. We also know that professions that are exposed to trauma, just as part of what they do for a living, are at an increased risk of suicide. So our first responders, our fire, our EMS, our police officers, military service members, and veterans for whom they are, especially when they are deployed to war zones, healthcare providers, and expanding that definition of healthcare providers, I think, is also very important. Case in point, I take my dog sometimes to a local kennel, and there I have encountered a couple of staff who used to do housekeeping in one of our local hospitals. And they said to me one day, we both just kind of decided with each other that we had to leave and do something else because of just how traumatic that job is. And I had never thought about that before. But it's not just our doctors and our nurses and people that we traditionally think about in those roles, but also the people who are exposed to having to do the cleanup in, say, an emergency room or a trauma room. So we kind of have to think about these professions in an expanded way here, to include veterinarians, those who do work with animals, but also professions that require isolation. And this is one of those kind of rural problems that we face when it comes to suicide, is we do have a lot of agriculture and oil, and not just isolation, but these are professions where finances for the individual can be very, very unstable, kind of a feast or famine kind of thing, construction and mining work. And so we want to be attentive to these vulnerable populations as well. We also would be remiss on a TASA webinar if we didn't talk about our sexual assault survivors. So we know that sexual assault survivors, and this seems kind of obvious on the surface, that they are more likely to be diagnosed with depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. We do know that over 1/3 of female rape survivors have actually contemplated suicide, and 13% have actually made an attempt. So I know that I have a lot of victim advocates on the call today. And I think that this just really highlights the importance of doing some thorough screening, even if you don't suspect that somebody is struggling with thoughts of suicide. If you start to see the signs of PTSD or depression or some of those other warning signs that we've talked about in the clients that you're working with, do some assessing and do some asking of the important questions that we're going to cover here in just a moment, because we know that those survivors are at a 10%, or rather a 10 times increased risk. We know that risk further multiplies 3 to 4 times if that first assault was prior to the age of 16. So just something to keep in mind there. I know, again, I'm probably preaching to the crowd here just a little bit, but we cannot forget about our male sexual assault survivors. So we know that about 1 in 10 rape victims are male, and about 3% of American men, therefore, have experienced a rape or an attempted rape. We also know that 1 in 6 males have been otherwise sexually abused or assaulted. So this is something that greatly affects men as well. And they too are at an increased risk of things like alcohol and substance use, suicide, PTSD. They often struggle with intimate relationships, as women do as well, and often struggle with underachievement in school and at work. So for men and women both, sexual assault increases risk of suicide as well. So just by nature of being a victim's advocate, you are working with those, a very vulnerable population. Also, I have found it kind of important to address the question of why suicide. Why would somebody consider this as an option? And we've talked a little bit about these things, but we do know that 70% of them may suffer from some kind of a mental health condition, so diagnosable depression or bipolar disorder. But in many of these cases, a suicide may seem very, very impulsive. And that's because there's often some kind of a straw that broke the camel's back. So you may have somebody who has struggled their whole life with depression and anxiety, and were fine until there was the right kind of concoction of stressors going on that served as a catalyst for that suicide. That's why it can sometimes seem so very sudden and out of the blue. And so when we talk about those risk factors, also think about things like ends of a relationship of some kind. So has this person been through a recent divorce or a recent breakup? Have they recently lost a family member or a friend? At the heart of many of these suicide attempts, you will find some kind of relationship strain or relationship loss that we have to take into consideration. Have they recently suffered a termination from work? So again, we live in that very work-centric culture, and we identify most, with what we do for a living in many cases. And so losing that work, losing that important job, a lot of people feel like they've lost a huge part of themselves. But in all things, there is this perceived inability to cope with pain and misfortune. And so what we have are those who don't necessarily desire to end their life. They just want to end this pain. And, when I was working with a suicide loss survivor, she kind of framed it in a powerful way, and she probably put it much more beautifully than I can here. But she says, when I think about my son's death by suicide, as weird as it seems, it's been helpful for me to think about, what happened on September 11th. And we all saw the news footage where we saw people diving from the upper floors of the World Trade Center. And by definition, yes, those were suicides, technically. But what did they have behind them? You know, what were they facing down directly behind them before they jumped? It was this towering inferno. And they had this decision, you know, that they had to make. And she goes, and when I think about my son's emotional experience, you know, I can only imagine that when he looked inward, he just saw this towering inferno inside. And for him, it was about that choice. Do I stick with this really painful problem that I have to deal with, or do I end my life? And that was the precipice that he found himself on. And you know, I think that really kind of points to that suicide ambivalence. If they could choose to live, if they could see their choices rationally in the moment, they would choose life. And so inevitably, you will find yourself on a news article about suicide, or maybe you've seen a local suicide and you're looking in the comments section on Facebook, or you're on Twitter, and inevitably you will see somebody who makes a comment about that person being selfish. And this is a struggle for a lot of people, especially those who are grieving a suicide loss. And when somebody is grieving a suicide loss, I recommend validating everything they are feeling, because a lot of folks struggle with anger toward their loved one, and they do view this action as selfish. But I like to, without forcing this on anybody, consider another perspective here. I love this quote from Adina Robleski, and she wrote this in her book, Suicide, Why, in 1995. And it is a quote used by the American Association of Suicidology in their Survivors of Suicide Handbook. And that is, choice implies, you know, when we ask whether or not suicide is a choice somebody makes, choice implies that a suicidal person can reasonably look at alternatives and select among them. If they could rationally choose, it would not be suicide. Suicide happens when no other choices are seen. And so the idea is that somebody who dies by suicide, they're not in a rational state of mind where they're able to choose necessarily at the time of their death between some of these options. It's just that they view death as less objectionable as living with intense emotional pain. And they have this distorted view of the world and problems as being unsolvable and permanent, and the world is a very dangerous or untrustworthy place to be. And of course, this always kind of brings about, so what about death with dignity? What about what some may call physician-assisted suicide? This question always comes up when we're talking about selfishness. And this is one of the main reasons why the American Association of Suicidology has kind of stepped away from having an opinion about death with dignity, because we kind of separate that out from suicide as we think about it. And so just something to keep in mind there. And we also know that substance intoxication is a factor. That should say 1/3 of suicide deaths. That number, I think, has seemingly gone down in the research, because we do have that decreased inhibition and judgment at the time of death. And so that's what Joyner and his colleagues call an acquired capacity for suicide, where previously a person may not have had what they viewed as the capacity to take their own life. But when we bring alcohol or some other substance into that equation, now all of a sudden we aren't so fearful of pain or what suicide would mean for us personally, or we don't have those protective religious beliefs, which can be protective in some cases, holding us back, because we now have a substance in our system that has decreased our judgment. And so I know we're kind of coming up towards the end here, so I want to make sure we get to this part where we talk about how we can help. When you're talking to somebody that you are concerned about, please do the following things. Please be yourself. You do not have to change who you are for the person. Let them know that you care and that they are not alone. And so verbalize this out loud. In everything you do, please be empathic and calm and patient as they speak. And as victim advocates, I'm having a hard time saying that phrase today. As law enforcement officers, you very likely got some experience and training in how to be empathic and calm and keep your body posture open. And so I won't belabor that point too much. But in all things, offer hope and let them know that help is available and that you can help guide them. But the big key thing is ask directly about those thoughts of suicide. We don't want to be ambiguous here. And this is really hard sometimes. There are some emotions that sometimes hold us back. What if they say yes? And it's hard not to feel like you've got the world on your shoulders, that you have to fix this problem. But really, all you need to be is a listening ear for them and somebody who is willing to ask the right questions. And so ask directly, are you considering suicide? Are you considering killing yourself? Are you considering taking your own life? Those point to a very specific action. We have to get at whether or not they are thinking about ending their own life. Are you having thoughts of harming yourself is an important question, but it's a little ambiguous, because that could mean, are you having thoughts of cutting or burning yourself? If you're having a thought of going and getting a tattoo after lunch, I mean, that is kind of a form of self-harm if you think about it. So it's very ambiguous to say, are you having thoughts of harming yourself? Our questioning has to get at the heart of the suicidal act. And so ask directly. There are some things that you want to avoid. I know we love to say there are no right or wrong answers. There are some things we want to steer clear of. We don't want to argue with the person using phrases like, but you have so much to live for, or look on the bright side, or your suicide will hurt your family, because this is likely somebody who is already struggling with vulnerability, and they may feel a sense of shame or embarrassment already talking about this. What they don't need is somebody who just adds shame and embarrassment on top of that. This is not the time to debate things like the value of life, or offer your personal or religious views on the morality of suicide. Now, I'm not saying that you have to let go of those beliefs. You can hold on to those beliefs, but that's not who they need you to be in the moment. We also don't want to promise confidentiality, because you may have to take some steps to get them some help that involves you being vocal about what they're struggling with on their behalf. And you're not there to fix the issues. Unless they ask for some advice or some guidance, I would avoid giving unsolicited advice, or leading them to feel as though they need to somehow justify these feelings for you. And so you're not there to fix, you're just there to listen and ask the right questions. So when you spot the signs, ask directly. And when you ask directly, also monitor your tone a little bit. There's a difference between, are you having thoughts of suicide, and you're not having thoughts of suicide, are you? When you do that, you're basically shutting the door to that communication. You're already telling them what you hope the answer is going to be, and they may respond in a way that just, they're trying to keep you comfortable at that point. So you want to make sure you mind that tone, and then we want to evaluate the level of risk involved and prepare to take help. So there's a couple of methods you can use to evaluate risk and ask these questions. There is the Plaid PALS method, if you are an acronym kind of person. And so, is there a plan for suicide? Is that plan lethal? Do they have available means to carry out that plan? Does this person have a physical or mental illness? Are they showing the signs that we've talked about today? Do they have a history of this kind of thinking and behaving? Have they made previous attempts? Are they alone? Do they have social support? Are they with somebody right now? Have they suffered a major loss of some kind? And are they engaging in some kind of substance use? And is that a chronic substance use issue or something current? And so lots of questions you can kind of run through in your mind here to ask that person and to guide that conversation. But my preferred method is actually option number 2. This is an evidence-based screener that is public domain. It is free of charge to use and reproduce. It has been kind of studied and created by a program called the Lighthouse Project. And you can find their information at this link right here, cssrs.columbia.edu. And this is the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. And so if you do not know how to phrase these questions in the moment, if you asked the questions on this screener exactly as they are written, the evidence behind this screener shows that you are getting the information that you need to keep this person safe. So you simply start with questions 1 and 2. Have you wished you were dead or wished you could go to sleep and not wake up? Have you actually had any thoughts about killing yourself? And if the answer is yes to question number 2, you want to move to questions 3, 4, 5, and 6, which ask a little more detail about planning and intention. And it's got a great little scale here that you can kind of use to monitor whether or not they're low, medium, or high risk, and some detailed instructions here that you can follow to get that person help if they need it. And so I highly recommend this screener. It is created in such a way that you do not have to be a clinician or a licensed mental health professional to use it. In fact, they have many different versions of this depending on who you are: law enforcement officer, victims advocate, educator, family member. They truly created this so that anybody can use it. And it would be a great addition to any policy and procedure that you have if you're a victims advocate. Um, so I highly recommend using that method. But the key, we want to get the person someplace safe. Suicidal thoughts are considered a life-threatening condition. That is why in most hospitals, if somebody comes in and they are having thoughts of suicide, they are taken straight back to get help, because it is akin to having a heart attack or having a stroke. It is a life-threatening situation. And so the key is to make sure that that person gets to a safe place. We never want to leave a suicidal person alone or let them drive their vehicle. And sometimes when we're trying to coordinate care for somebody, that can be really, really difficult, because they may say, you know what, I can just go ahead and drive to, such and such hospital. We want to try to discourage that. And in order to do that, we want to see what we can do to enlist helpful family and friends. And if it's just not a safe situation, if the person is combative, or if you as the helper feel any way unsafe, if they are unwilling to get help and they are in immediate danger, or you just aren't sure how to handle this situation, please enlist law enforcement and call 911, as this is an emergency situation. Some safe places to go: you can always go to an emergency room, a psychiatric hospital, but a lot of people prefer going the least restrictive route possible. And so if you are able to get to an outpatient mental health clinic or a counseling center, they may be able to do some emergency counseling with this person and set up some ongoing outpatient appointments, because that way you have a person who can receive treatment that is evidence-based while getting to stay at home with their family and live their life. And so there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there's more than just psychiatric hospitalization available, so that folks can get the treatment they need for their suicidal thoughts. So those are all safe places to consider, some more restrictive than others. A lot of y'all may work a hotline of some kind. My recommendation is, in your policies and procedures, have some method of starting to gather some demographic information about the person. Most importantly, that phone number and the current location, because what often happens on a hotline call, if somebody starts talking about suicide, is you try to very cleverly kind of figure out where they are. And now they don't want to provide information to you because they've made this really big revelation, and they may fear what happens next. Are they going to send a cop out to my house to detain me? And so if you can try to make it your policy to gather some of this information in the beginning, you may be more likely to get some of that life-saving information. Because if you do have to call in a welfare check, they're going to want to know where this person is. But even if all you have is the phone number, they can work a lot of magic in kind of trying to figure out where this person is at. Take notes on specific statements that are made to you that concern you. Make sure that you enlist some help if you believe that somebody is in danger. And in most cases, as long as you are enlisting help from a fellow advocate, or even in some cases a family member, to get this person a welfare check or get them where they need to be, as long as you are releasing need to know information in order to keep this person safe, you are going to be legally protected. In all things, just follow your hotline's policies and procedures. I highly recommend reviewing those policies and procedures if you haven't already. If you want to revise those policies and procedures, I'm always happy to take a look at them and take a glance over them. In a prior life, I was doing nonprofit management and kind of helped develop some of the suicide policies and procedures there. I do not mind sending along some best practices to you. So lethal means restriction, the most helpful thing that you can do. And I know that we're kind of coming up on time here. We do know that firearms are the most lethal method. Over 90% of wounds from firearms are lethal. And we know that medications kind of come as a close second in terms of the method of choice. And so, but less than 10% of those overdoses are actually lethal, because what winds up happening is people start to experience that sense of regret after they've taken the overdose, and they go seek life-saving help. And so we do know, looking at the research, people are generally faithful to their chosen means of suicide. And we know that many of those attempts are made during short-term crises. So anything that you can do to help a person restrict access to those means, we want to make sure that we do that. So that means safely stowing away firearms, sharps, and medications. And we'll just go ahead and take the most lethal means here as an example of that. We know that gun locks, so if you want to know what a gun lock looks like, it's that yellow lock that's kind of positioned around that gun right there. They are the least effective means, form of means restriction. A cheap pair of bolt cutters will take care of that lock in an instant. If we can get guns locked away to where the person who is experiencing thoughts of suicide doesn't know the safe code, that's a better option, but the best option is making sure that we recruit a friend or a family member to get those guns out of the house and away from the person. And same thing goes for sharps like knives and scissors, things of that nature. Medications are best given if the medication is the method of choice. People still need to be able to take their medications because some of those medications are necessary to sustain life. And so we want to give those medications to a family member or a friend to dole out as needed. But what we really want to do is buy time, because we know that about 48% of attempters, when asked about the time it took for them to think about the suicide and consider suicide as an option, to the time that they actually make an attempt, was only about 10 minutes. So for about half of people who attempt, it only took 10 minutes from the time they thought about it to the time they attempted. So anything we can do to buy time is important, which is where I bring in safety planning. So if you've never used a safety plan before, this is a great example. Again, this one is public domain, free of charge, and it just simply helps people line out what their warning signs are, some things that they can do to cope in the moment, some people in social settings and people that they can ask for help, and professional agencies they can reach out to when they are in crisis. And the idea is that somebody who is having thoughts of suicide can review this daily. They can keep it somewhere close by. They can even put a version of it in their phone if they would like to, but it gives them a tool that they can use in the moment when they are feeling suicidal. They can reach for this instead of their chosen means and engage in one of the activities on this safety plan. Very different from a no harm contract. No harm contracts are those things that we used to do where somebody just signs a piece of paper that says, I'm not going to harm myself. Those are absolutely ineffective. But safety plans, if they can do a safety plan with somebody and have access to this, it cuts risk of suicide in half, because we start engaging them in problem solving here. In the moment, what can I do to buy time? A walk in the woods, you can do that for 10 minutes. Listening to some good music, you can do that for that 10 minutes. And what we find is if we can distract somebody for just 10 minutes, we can pull them out of that suicide crisis so that somebody can help them. So great suicide prevention tool there. So in summary, please remember your goals, watch for those signs, start the conversation. So if you've noticed the signs, you can just say, hey, I've noticed that you're really down lately, and I've noticed that you're really stressed out. And sometimes when that happens, people sometimes consider suicide. Are you having thoughts of suicide? It can be that simple, and it can be a lifesaver. Continue that conversation. Are they having thoughts? Are they moving into planning or intention? Do they have access to a means for suicide? And guide them towards help. And there are so many different communities on the call today, and I know we got to wrap up here. Make sure you know who your resources are in the community, and help with lethal means restriction when you can, and see if you can help them make a plan to cope, because what you're doing there is you're helping buy time. And so in conclusion, thank you so much for doing your part to prevent Texas suicides. Some great resources here that hopefully we can get sent out to you to help you celebrate Mental Health Awareness Month, which is May. Lots of different things you can post on social media to bring some awareness to that. And y'all can always reach out to me with questions. And always reach out to me with feedback too. I'd love to improve this presentation. So please do let me know what I can do to help you. Great resources here to learn more that helped inform this presentation today. And that is what I have for you. Are there any questions?
And one of the things that was in the chat box, Greg, that you might want to speak to is that for people of color, it can sometimes be more difficult for them to interact with law enforcement. So calling in an emergency, there needs to be a good plan for making sure when that happens. So.
Absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that. And so that full comment, just to kind of see, because I feel like there's something in there. It might be also to help work with peer support and help with a WRAP, a wellness action plan and self-directed plan for crisis. People often don't share because the help often feels like punishment. Absolutely. And this is kind of why I say calling law enforcement to me is kind of a last ditch option. In an ideal situation, what you would love to see is that we have somebody who has a connection with a family member or a friend, and the person is willing to seek help for themselves. And they have a person, that they trust that can help them get to that help. And we do this in a very non-restrictive fashion, where our first instinct isn't to call law enforcement and get them out there, because it can feel a lot like an arrest. And you do have people of color who historically have struggled with discriminatory policing practices. And so certainly something that you want to keep in mind. And that is a great point. So I like to talk about going with the least restrictive means possible for that person's safety in the moment. Rosalinda says, will a recording be made available? My understanding is yes, it will be on YouTube. And so absolutely. Crystal, did I miss any conversation here in the chat?
No, I think we covered everything in the chat. We have one question that just got posted. How ineffective did you say no harms agreement are?
So ineffective, and I don't know the percentage, but they are so ineffective that one of the people who did my training said, if I ever hear about a practitioner engaging in the use of no harm agreements in place of something like a safety plan, I will personally make it my mission to ensure that you never practice again. Mm-hmm. So the research is that definitive, that the leading experts on training clinicians say that you are not to do that. And so I think about to link this to another kind of thing that we often pledge about. So purity pledges or, abstinence pledges when it comes to sexual education, we know that those have about a 90% failure rate. And really any of that 10 to 12% of success may just be left up to individual choice and not so much the agreement itself. I would guess that it hovers around somewhere between 90 to 100%. That is, the use of the no harm agreement doesn't even surpass chance in terms of why it's effective. And so just very much ineffective there. No harm agreements, not helpful. Safety plan actually protects your clients and protects you legally. So if you are working for an agency that uses no harm agreements, my urging to you is to delete them from your computer, throw the rest in a recycle bin, and go with safety planning.
All right, and definitely, yeah, if you need help updating those no harms, I was also trained with no harms, so I have a lot of experience like in that shifting language. So definitely reach out to me, reach out to Greg, and how we can improve those forms, because I know some of them are old and they get stuck in the computer and you print them out with the same typo and all that stuff for 20 years. So we have better practices, we know better. My allergies are gonna make my voice go, but we can do better for survivors that come to see us. So thank you, Greg, again for being here.
Absolutely.
We're gonna stay on just a little bit longer if anybody needs to unmute and wants to talk to us. And I have the links that I mentioned in the beginning of the session. There's 3 that I'm going to post. The first one is for where you can find this recording, as well as all of the other webinars that presenters have agreed to have posted on YouTube. And then our conference registration and the NOVA training for anybody who wants to get more information about attending that those sessions in June. So just posted up that.
And I will say, on safety planning, I think that safety planning is one of the single most effective things that you can do as a helper. And I could probably do an entire day on safety planning. And so if you have any questions about how that works, feel free to reach out to me. I've got some material on questions that you can ask when kind of working through those sections of a safety plan, so that it doesn't sound like you're just reading from the safety plan. Like, what are your warning signs? Like, it's really good to ask some open-ended questioning there. So Crystal, is there a way to like email something out to participants, like materials, things like that?
Yes,
Cool.
we have a copy of everybody's email that was in attendance today. So
beautiful. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send that to Crystal.
File directly. If you have that ready to go, you can attach a file to the chat box. So
really, I don't know that I have it available,
okay.
But what I will do, I will send essentially a second slide deck. I'll send this slide deck that we went through today so that you've got that information. I will send along another slide deck that's just focused on some safety planning questions that you can ask, so that you can guide that conversation a little more in an open-ended, non-robotic kind of way. But if you can get a safety plan with somebody, or put it in their phone, because not a lot of people just want a worksheet. I'm going to put the name of an app here, the My3 app, in the chat box. You can actually download this app on your phone for free and put an app, or rather a safety plan in your phone, because that's sometimes just where people are at. They're on their phones. Worksheet. What is it they say in the movie Ghostbusters? Print is dead, or something like that. You can use your phone too for that safety plan. But yeah, ditch the no harms.
I love how advanced we've become. I still have worksheets in my office when I first started that were on the purple print, and you kept a big file because you never knew when you were going to be able to go down to the printer to get copies. So
absolutely. Another thing, so if you're face to face with somebody and you're doing a safety plan, and this sounds super simple, when you're doing a face-to-face safety plan, have them write out the safety plan. I mean, guide them through the process, but they get a little more ownership if they are writing out that safety plan themselves, or they're putting that safety plan in their phone. Also crucial that when we're listing out people to call, we don't just list their relationship, we list their name, because when we're having thoughts of suicide and we're looking at our safety plan, those are a little more emotionally hard hitting if we don't just see sister. If we see Deidre or Sarah and we see their name, that's going to jar us out of our suicidal ideation a little more effectively than just sister or brother. And so the name of that app again is My3 app. That's the My3 app. And I think it's my3app.org, but if you just Googled My3 app, it's going to come up for you. Or if you look in your Google Play Store, or your whatever you iPhone folks use, your iPhone store, Apple Store, I don't know what it's called. If you looked into My3 app on your app store, you'll find it.
Again, just want to say thank everybody for their time. I noticed East Texas Crisis Center has put some stuff up on their website that they have done for Mental Health Awareness Month. So if your organization is wanting to post, they might have some great examples on their social media for you. And if there's not anything else or no other questions, we're going to go ahead and end this webinar. And we look forward to seeing you again on March 25th. We will be having a webinar for the military, because it's also Military Month. So we will be talking about bystander intervention and some of the programming that the military does for that. So thank you, everybody.
Awesome. My email's in the chat. If y'all need to get a hold of me, feel free. Stay well.